was really lucky. I actually found out that that's what I wanted to do in first year university, and that's because I had the good fortune to take a great course. But there's a little bit of a funny side to this. I'm bilingual, French and English, and so I took an undergraduate course in philosophy, and it was awful. They were talking about this old guy, Socrates, and I thought, oh my gosh, I have to get out of this class. And a friend of mine said, take it in French, it's so much better. I did. I took myself out of the English version of Philosophy 101, went into the French version of Philosophy 101, and they were talking about masturbation and the Vatican's perspective on that. And I thought, this is philosophy, I can do this, I can do this. And so there spawned a career. Well, I think applied ethics can be a lot of things to a lot of different people. And for some people, it really is very formulaic. And it's very much a cookbook. And here's ethics, here's an application. I do applied ethics. For some of us, I think it's a little bit more complicated. And I think what holds it together is this understanding that there is a foundation in ethics, and that ethics is a discipline, and that it has a theoretical grounding for the kinds of claims that can be made. But there's a desire to see that outside the ivory tower. There's a desire to see all of that richness come to bear in the real world in a way where it might actually have an impact on people's lives. And the bottom line is it will have an impact. The issue is, can it be an impact for good? So impact ethics really comes to the fore right now amongst a small group of people, but we really hope it's going to grow in terms of both number and size and understanding, because we're actually trying to figure out ourselves what we mean by impact ethics and what is the scope of it. But what we know is what it isn't, and we know that with certainty. And what it isn't is a lot of what we're seeing right now, which is people who are doing things that look like applied ethics, but it's either extremely conservative or, and here I don't mean conservative in a political sense, I mean conservative in the sense of it's just an opinion, it's just a perspective, or you might say, I'm the ideal observer. I mean, another set of terms or language, but there's this idea that you don't really want to get your hands messy in the real world. You don't actually really want anybody to act on what you've said, because all you're doing is, counseling or facilitating or, doing some general education. And there are many of us that are really sort of frustrated with that. We think that it ought to be about something that's much closer to advocacy and activism. And what we find is that those that are really committed to the academy get nervous around that. And they actually, some will go so far as to say that's just not the business of applied ethics, that what you ought to be doing is rigorous scholarship, but you're not out there fighting fights. And I guess there's some of us that think, well, what's the point of doing any of the other stuff if you're not out there fighting the good fight? So impact ethics is about social transformation, if you want to use technical terms, and in not so technical terms, it's about going out there and getting yourself dirty, having a good fight. That's a tough question for me to answer for the following reasons. I've done a lot of work, in my time over what it means to do the job well. And in that context, I've typically thought about it as having a knowledge component, a skill component, and a component that I've talked about in terms of character traits. And that really has been the most controversial of the three components. So if we look at professional type organizations like the ASBH, they're very comfortable with offering up comments on what's the knowledge and what's the skills. They don't really have a lot of comfort around the issue of character and virtue. And at the end of the day, I think you can have all the knowledge in the world and you can be a master at any number of skills. But if you're not the right kind of person, I don't think you're going to do a good job. And I think that in lots of ways, I think of a colleague of mine, Howard Brody, and I, at one point, we asked the question, can you do good bioethics and cheat on your taxes? And we were surprised by the number of people who said yes. They answered that in the affirmative, and they were able to do that because they could say, look, if you know all of the theories and if you've got all of the skills, whether they're skills in terms of public speaking or skills in terms of persuasion, whatever, you could go into a hospital and do a really good job. And I was just perplexed because I thought, so what happens to the idea of role modeling? If you can treat people disparagingly, but you've got all the knowledge and skills in the world, do I really want you holding up a shingle that says, I'm a professional ethicist, or I'm an ethics consultant, or whatever title you want to give yourself, is that the kind of person we want to encourage and hold up as a role model? No. And don't misunderstand me. I've been accused of making all kinds of claims about moral expertise, and people have said, in terms of criticizing some of my work, that you're setting the standard too high. People aren't God. You're not God. And my response is that's to totally misunderstand what I'm saying. You can have experts and you can have expertise without making any claims to having access to the truth, right? Today I had a wonderful opportunity to go and look at Frank Lloyd Wright's work. Does somebody want to say that he was an expert architect? I'm prepared to say that. Do I want to say that he had access to the truth about beauty and architecture? No. But I can still make the claim that he was an expert. And some people might say, no, he wasn't an expert, but he had expertise, and we can argue about the level of knowledge and skill and whatever contribution. But I think there's something there that's being lost in the translation, and we shouldn't be afraid to say that there are such things as persons with moral expertise, and perhaps there might be a few that are actually moral experts, and none of that has to do with saying they have access to the truth. The one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is courage, and I think about that for a lot of reasons. And originally I was thinking about it in relatively narrow terms. So for me, it meant standing up for what you believed in, and standing up in a context where there might be consequences for you personally or ideologically or what have you. But it really meant taking a stand. And I have to say that over the years, I think I would describe it as a somewhat more sophisticated understanding of that, insofar as in many cases, you don't actually have the experience of courage because you're just doing what's right. And to other people, it looks like courage, and yet if you go and you talk to that person afterwards, they don't have the experience of having come up against something and having had to fight for or experience any negative consequences. They will say to you, they didn't have a choice. They were just doing what was right. And the other way in which I think my understanding of courage has changed is I've actually watched people do things that I think of as extremely courageous, and I've watched people around them redescribe what they've done as arrogance. And that has really, again, led me to interrogate how do we understand the concept of courage, such that we can denigrate people who, in fact, if you had a full understanding of what was happening, really ought to be lauded for having done something that was really important and courageous, and yet part of marginalizing them, because obviously there's an issue of disagreement about which they're called to act in a courageous fashion, that you can kind of just sideline them. So I think for me, the issue still is courage. I guess I'm just a lot less sure what it means in terms of all of its complexity. I think that we're at a point where people who do applied ethics are moving more and more towards professionalization, and some people would say we're already there. And we see that in the trappings of movements towards accreditation, codes of ethics, etc. I would encourage us to think about what we lose as we go down that path. And I would also encourage us to think about what are some of the tough cases that are part of contemporary bioethics that really don't require much more than a decent human being acting courageously. And I think that one of the things that is difficult for us to sort of get a handle on is what's the contribution of the professionalization to the way in which we respond to a contemporary ethical challenge.